idyllic and tranquil environment of the rocky shore. Those memories of when you were a child and you went rockpooling and just found all of these awesome and cool species, be fooled into thinking that these are calm and tranquil environments where every and any species would love to live, but you would be wrong. All the species here face a number of really stressful environmental factors that they have to cope with on an hourly basis. And all these species here have adapted over thousands of years to survive on this rocky shore. But even within the shore, certain species can only survive in certain zones, and that's because we have tides. What rules where things live on this shore is the tide. Basically, the longer you're out of water, the higher up the shore you are, the more stress you're going to be put under, because you're basically thrust out of what you're used to. You go from completely being in water to completely being in air. Imagine being chucked underwater and told to breathe for 6 hours, which is just unbelievable. Luckily for them, they've had a bit more time to adapt over the years, rather than just being chucked in, but the idea is still there, that this is still a highly stressful thing for these species to cope and deal with, and they have to come up with these adaptations to do so. It also means that you can basically read the shore. If you start at the top and work your way down, you'll start to notice that meter by meter you see different species, because meter by meter the conditions are changing, because that meter has had a certain amount more time or less time out of water. And that's what I'm going to be showing you today. I'm going to be showing you that every single species on this shore has fought to be here. They have adapted and fought off their competitors and really deserve a spot on the rocky shore, because they're having to cope with so much stress. As we work our way down the shore, I'll show you how it starts to change and why and how we find different creatures as we go. Right at the upper shore is when everything is going to be the worst for creatures, and they're going to have to use the most adaptations to survive. For species that's called to survive out of the rock, one of the biggest problems is going to be desiccation, which is basically all of the moisture coming out of their bodies and they completely dry out. There are only a few seaweeds that can cope with this. This is Paviva, a seaweed that you are going to find right at the top of the shore. In fact, there is no really other seaweeds that are going to be able to survive at this level, because this guy is going to be out of the water for the most amount of time, for the full 6 hours. And it's the most well adapted seaweed to retaining this water, trying to keep moist and trying to just keep from completely drying out, which is pretty much one of the main problems of being out of a rock pool and right at the top of the shore. One of the ways this guy does that is that it is curved. It's got curled leaves that kind of tries to trap as much moisture in and kind of creates like a mini atmosphere within the curl where less water is kind of leaving, and that just helps to slow down the evaporation and hopefully stop it from becoming completely dried out. Species such as limpets get around desiccation at the top of the shore because they have a shell, and they can form a really tight clamp to the rock. If you tried to get that off right now, you would not be able to, and that really means it can lock in moisture and stay dry until the tide comes in. But this guy won't be moving, won't be getting food. This guy might get predated on a lot less, because some of the species that eat it aren't going to be able to get to this because no one else wants to be up in the shore, on the upper shore and out of the rock pools. But this guy himself isn't going to be getting any food for 6 hours. So although predation might be a lot less, he's also going to get hungry, and that's the trade-off. That's why rocky shore stuff is so interesting, because half the time a lot of this is a trade-off between, you know, can I survive in these really harsh conditions, and is it worth it to not get eaten? And for a few species living on the upper shore, it really is. A quick glance in an upper shore rock pool and you'll quickly realise there is a lot less life in it. And that's because living in a rock pool in the upper shore is still a really stressful environment. One of the things that they're struggling with is salinity, and being a marine creature, that is quite important. Now the reason salinity changes right at the top of the shore is because it is exposed for longer. Out in the sun there is going to be a lot of evaporation happening out of these pools, and the salt is heavier than the water part in salt water. So the water will evaporate off into the atmosphere, but the salt will remain behind, and that means that salinity is rising. And that can be really toxic and really impact these species. Other way that salinity can be a big problem is if we have a lot of rain, and these can potentially become almost fresh water. Again, that puts a mass stress on their body because their tissues are trying to keep this equilibrium to stop salt leaving and stop salt coming in. They're trying to just remain the same. But if the salt gets too high or too low, it can actually start to move into the body and really can kill these species if it becomes too much of a problem. Now it's important to remember with this that the issue itself isn't the adaptation to salinity. There are hypersaline pools in the world where even bacteria live in the most saltiest conditions ever really found. But it's the variability of it. These species have to cope from almost freshwater to fully marine to somewhere further than fully marine, all within the space of a couple of hours, and then in 6 hours the tide will come back in and it will change again. And that's what makes these species so absolutely incredible, is their ability to deal with the hourly by hourly changes, even minute by minute changes, and survive in these really harsh conditions. In these rock pools, oxygen is also going to be a problem as well, and that's because in the sea there's plenty of oxygen because it's really energetic, and there's a lot of mixing between the atmosphere and the sea where oxygen can move into the ocean. So oxygen is never a problem in the surface of the sea. However, these rock pools are small and they're still. There's not a lot of interaction between the atmosphere and the actual pools themselves. So if you get a ton of species filling up these rock pools and using oxygen readily, then actually these pools can run out and these species can almost suffocate underwater. That's why you don't find a lot of species and not a lot of energetic species right at the top of the shore, because they really just can't cope with the oxygen. One species that gets around this is little tiny littorinid snails. They're a lot smaller at the top of the shore, which also helps with the idea of desiccation, but they have the ability to switch how they produce oxygen. They can switch to anaerobic oxygen from aerobic oxygen, which basically limits and reduces the amount of oxygen that they need to survive. And these are the sort of adaptations that you have to be able to develop, to go through, to be able to survive right at the top of the shore, which I think is pretty incredible. So for the few seaweed species that can survive in the upper shore and maybe down into the mid-shore where there still might be a bit of a problem, sunlight can be a real issue on the rocky shore for the majority of the day, and on days like this, especially in summer, in intense sunlight and high UV radiation, then that sunlight can actually be harmful. Now they get around this with a really cool and unique adaptation, is that they will bleach the first few layers of their cells. Now this seaweed is sea lettuce, and it's only a few cell layers thick anyway, and it's able to bleach the top layer, which means that it turns white. Now white is one of the colours that reflects a lot of this UV and light straight back, and so it means it protects the inner layers, which can still remain alive, so that when it's less sunny they can return to their usual green pigmented colour and survive the harsh sunlight of summer. It seems unfair, doesn't it, that with everything else going on, they also have to work out a way to deal with sunlight too and can't just enjoy a sunny day. With a lot of sun, you also have big changes in temperature. Air will heat up a lot quicker than water, and that means it's really different from the temperature of the sea. So I've just been out to the water's edge, and putting your hands in summer is not terrible, but there is a real difference in the temperature that you feel on your hands. It really is a temperature difference of night and day from the top of the shore. And these are the temperature differences that these species have to deal with all of the time. The top rock pools are going to get so hot from the sun in comparison to the sea, which is such a large body of water that really the only time it changes temperature is with seasons, because it will take weeks and months to affect the entire temperature of the sea. But let's talk positives. Why do these species bother living in such a harsh environment? Why go to all this hassle of adaptations? Well, one of them is because space is so unbelievably limited when it comes to sessile things that settle on substrates, because the ocean is so unbelievably competitive. In that sea there are billions and millions of tiny little spawning creatures all looking for a space and a place to call their home, and the amount of creatures and larvae that are in that ocean compared to the amount of rock that is available is very disproportionate. There is a lot more creatures looking for homes than there are homes to have. So being able to find a space to occupy on the shore is a real benefit if you can kind of fit into a niche that other species can't, and you can find space to live on. And also there is a lot more space up on the upper shore because there are fewer species that can survive and be adapted to do so. A lot of the species that you find on the upper shore are only found here. They've picked their niche and they're setting to it. As we make our way down to mid-shore, you'll see that it starts to get a lot more competitive and a lot more species start to enter into the mix. And the other reason is predation. A lot less stuff can survive up here. You don't have as many large crabs, you don't have as many large fish, because they are both energetic organisms, and in these environments it's difficult for them to survive for long periods of time, which means that you have a few hours respite a day where you're not having to look over your shoulder constantly, except for maybe the odd bird or seagull, because you know that there are less predators up there to kind of get you, and that's a real benefit to species. So that is the reason why species on the upper shore exists, but obviously it is very harsh environment, and we are about to make our way down to mid-shore now, and you'll start to see a lot more of a change. A lot more species start to enter into the mix, but with that we're entering into a zone that is much more competitive than the upper shore is. As we make our way down to mid-shore, you'll now start to realise that most of the zonation and most of the stuff you can read on the shore is governed by seaweeds. As soon as we start to hit upper middle shore, there are a lot more seaweeds that can start to survive. But of them, a few key species really start to band out and really zone up the middle shore. Here on a tall rock we can see within centimetres this banding occurring. The species that really marks the end of the upper shore is this species. It's called egg-rack because it has these egg-shaped bladders running down it, and this is an upper shore to mid-shore species. Now we can literally see it banded across the shore, because here we have absolutely tons of egg-rack for a couple of metres or so, but looking to my left there is none. It stops, because at that point it doesn't have the competitive advantage over other fucuses which have a much stronger hold on the mid-shore. And it's a really cool example of literally this is how exact and how direct and how within a few centimetres really it's all these factors affect and completely change what is here and what grows. After egg-rack, it's really the species Fucus vesiculosus which then really dominates the mid-shore and really does well there. That's because brown seaweeds are adapted to cope in the mid-range of the shore. That means they can hold enough water to survive as the tide goes out until it comes back in. But also that when you feel it to the touch, they stay quite moist, and that means that other species like crabs and snails and anemones can all hide under this seaweed to stay wet until the tide comes back in. And that has a real positive effect on the amount of life that you can find on the mid-shore. it really increases the amount of species you're going to find that are adapted to live here compared to the upper shore. Just by simply moving back some of this fucus, you can start to see just how wonderful the life underneath is. Many more types of seaweeds that can't cope with being dried out are found hidden underneath, including this beautiful pink encrusting seaweed that covers the rocks. Even just under one individual of this fucus, you can find sponges, a diverse amount of red seaweeds, a limpet, a predator, which is this dog whelk, and these awesome barnacles. But you find the real diversity of life when we enter the water. Midshore rock pools are the perfect place for seaweeds that don't want to dry out but still love a lot of light. And this means you'll start to see such a rainbow of colours when you look in rock pools. You begin to find a real mix of creatures in close quarters, like the snail, brittle star and barnacle. But where creatures are found in such dense conditions, you are also going to find their predators. But the key thing about midshore is that these creatures are still spending hours out of the sea, and that means that they are protected from larger predators than them. So although you start to see crabs and fish, these are going to be small gobies and small crabs, things that like to remain away from their much bigger relatives that are going to be out in the ocean. And what you'll begin to notice is it really is a diverse group of species, not only for the fact that you find lots of fish, but each different type of fish will look and survive completely differently, because there is a lot of species living in one place, so they've each picked their kind of own niche adaptation to live in such a cramped environment. And again, it's this cramped environment why some species choose to live on the upper shore, out of the way of all of these different creatures. All these species start popping out in front of you. You can find an absolute diverse array of creatures. Within a matter of not even a metre squared, you can find dozens and dozens of different species and creatures hiding out in that one tiny section. Let alone if you extrapolate that and think about how many organisms are living on the hundreds of miles of coastline that is in Scotland and the UK. It's absolutely mind-blowing the amount of species, literally thousands, that can live on this rocky shore environment. Mussels are a good indicator that you have started to hit the lower shore environment, especially when you start to find their predators, the starfish. The species you are going to find on the lower shore are the species that don't like drying out, like this nudibranch, but they're also just going to be bigger and badder versions of what you have found on midshore, because you are not really exposed from the sea for very long at lower shore. The seaweed that absolutely dominates the lowest of the low shore are kelp beds that actually form amazing forest habitats. But to check out information on that, I have a whole separate episode of When the Tide Retreats, so make sure you head over and watch that after this video if you're interested. Down here on the lower shore is a different story. You're not having to deal with the extremer conditions of being exposed for longer, more sunlight, higher temperatures, because you're only exposed from the sea for a few minutes or maybe an hour or so every day. But that means that a lot more species have the ability to live right here, and that leads to an absolute ton of competition. If you're a species that live down here, then you are going to have to fight for prime real estate. You are going to have to be an individual that is very good at keeping not only other species away, but your own species too. you're going to fight for your place on the rocky shore. You're also going to have to fight for your food. This means that down on the lower shore there is so many predator-prey interactions, because there is a lot more species here, there is a lot more diversity, you're going to find more species and more of them, and that means more food. You're also in the sea for longer, which means that a lot of bigger predators can come along and gobble you up if they want to. Even at the lower shore, rocky shore species do not have it easy. They have to fight for every metre and every inch that they settle and survive. And that is why I am so in love and amazed every time I come down here and see so much life, because they have battled the elements and they really, really deserve to be right here. It's absolutely incredible that these species have adapted to live in such an environment, and for something that looks so idyllic and pristine to actually be really really difficult to live in, but full of so much life, supporting so much life in our oceans, being nursery grounds for juvenile species and habitats, and really providing such service to ecosystems in the UK is absolutely incredible, and just one of the reasons I love this shore so much. So hopefully next time you are down here, just give a little nod to the species and appreciate really the beauty of them being here, because they truly deserve it. Tune in next time for another episode of When the Tide Retreats.